Welcome back to another episode of the Speakeasy Health podcast, where we speak about hormone health topics in an easy way. I'm your host, Rocsi, a certified nutritionist and hormone health coach, and in today's episode, we have an exceptional guest joining us to speak about insulin resistance, metabolic health, PCOS misdiagnosis, nervous system dysregulation impact on our overall health, and more. Lara Bryden is a naturopathic doctor and the best-selling author of the Period Repair Manual, Hormone Repair Manual, and Metabolism Repair for Women. She currently has consulting rooms in Christchurch, New Zealand, where she treats women with PCOS, PMS, endometriosis, perimenopause, and many other hormone and period-related health problems. Welcome to the Speakeasy Health podcast, Lara. It's important to understand that some of the most common hormone struggles experienced by women in their reproductive years are painful and irregular cycles, weight gain, inflammation, or lack of energy. And it all ties in with insulin, as that is a foundation hormone alongside cortisol. And when we see imbalances here, we see imbalances everywhere. So, Lara, I would love to hear your thoughts on how that fits into what you see in terms of common hormonal imbalances, how insulin ties with it in your daily practices.
So insulin resistance, which is the sort of main hormonal condition that we're talking about today, is associated with chronically elevated levels of insulin. That the main women's health condition, the big one that it plays a major role in is, of course, PCOS, as you mentioned. And that's because chronically elevated insulin can increase testosterone in the body, and vice versa. Having a tendency to higher levels of testosterone in women will promote insulin resistance. So it becomes a vicious cycle. Insulin resistance can also play a pretty big role in some of the symptoms of perimenopause, making for a more difficult perimenopause transition. It can also make periods heavier, in part because it can combination of because it can impair ovulation and because it and therefore prevent the progesterone that women need for easier periods. Chronically high insulin can also make thicken the uterine lining, so make periods heavier. But insulin resistance, and it's very specific topic, so it's common, but it's not everyone. And I would say actually especially if your audience is a lot of women in their 20s, they probably do not have insulin resistance. The only sort of group of women, sort of younger women who do have insulin resistance possibly is women with PCOS or polycystic ovary syndrome. So I'll talk about this a bit more on kind of what insulin resistance is and why not everyone with PCOS has it, but a lot of women do. Just to say that young women in a reproductive year, especially women in their 20s, are actually somewhat protected from insulin resistance because of estrogen. So estrogen will tend to have a insulin sensitizing effect. So it doesn't mean women in their 20s can't get insulin resistance, but it's less common in that group for sure.
Let's just talk about, before we move forward, I feel like it would be good to actually explain what insulin resistance actually is, because it's a topic that a lot of people confuse with blood sugar imbalances, high and low.
Yeah.
I think that's like a really good connection in there. So maybe if you could start with explaining what insulin resistance is, that'd be amazing.
For sure. Yeah. So it's a hormonal insulin resistance it's a hormonal condition. It is common in the people in general. But like I said, it's less common in the younger women age group. But it is the situation of chronically elevated levels of insulin. It's not about insulin going up after a meal so much. It's about like a fasting baseline, higher level of insulin. So insulin obviously is an essential hormone, but it is supposed to, after some hours of between meals, especially overnight fasting, it should go. And by overnight fasting, I just mean the normal, not eating while you sleep.
Between meals.
Just the normal 12 hours of fasting. It should drop down to sort of a good baseline, depending on which units you're using, kind of between 4 and 8 milli-international units per liter. I talk about that in the book. Now, it can be too low too. And I will say, for what it's worth, in young women, I often see too low in fasting insulin, which means they're under eating. And actually insulin is part of the signaling for ovulation and everything. So with too low, with heavy dietary restriction and too low fasting insulin, women can develop irregular periods from that too. So, but sticking with the topic of what is insulin resistance, it's chronically elevated insulin. You can sometimes pick that up with a blood test for insulin, not for glucose. And it typically goes along with symptoms like high triglycerides, high blood pressure, sometimes something called fatty liver disease, which again, it's unusual in women in their 20s, but it can happen. And significant weight gain, specifically around the middle. So this is, increased waist circumference. And then there can also be symptoms like it will often go along with high androgens or high testosterone. So this is where it gets into the territory of PCOS. So there can be, facial hair, strong jawline acne, and then chronically high insulin can also impair ovulation or create irregular periods. But keeping in mind, too low insulin can do the same thing. So it's not like this is where it's really important to say that, and I've written about this extensively in my book and, in a few blog posts, including one called PCOS Cannot Be Diagnosed by Ultrasound. So just the absence, an irregular cycle doesn't automatically mean PCOS or insulin resistance at all. There are lots of reasons to have an irregular cycle. And the diagnosis of PCOS is particularly problematic because doctors have relied too heavily on the ultrasound finding of polycystic ovaries, which I'll just say is a useless finding. So ultrasound in general, a pelvic ultrasound can be helpful for diagnosing different things like ovarian cysts, which are different from PCOS. An ultrasound can diagnose, fibroids and things with the uterus. So an pelvic ultrasound can be important for some things, but it's not helpful when diagnosing PCOS. And the main reason is all it's really showing is an ovary that didn't ovulate that month for any reason. And some women who don't even have hormonal problems can occasionally just have a cycle where they don't ovulate and they show polycystic ovaries, and it doesn't mean anything. So you certainly could not diagnose insulin resistance based on a polycystic ovary on ultrasound. So that absolutely not. So or even diagnose PCOS based on that. So there's a lot of women being told they have PCOS when they actually have undereating or hypothalamic amenorrhea, which is, if you think about it, is the complete opposite of PCOS and insulin resistance. So, like I said, with hypothalamic amenorrhea or losing your period to undereating, insulin will typically be too low. So, yeah. So sticking with, I guess, if our topic is insulin resistance, it really is. You do have to have some of those things I'm talking about, like the high triglycerides, maybe the high cholesterol, the high blood pressure, the high fasting insulin, that's not what's happening, so it's not like and so it's not like having the symptom of hypoglycemia or a tendency to low blood sugar is not specific to insulin resistance. So people with insulin resistance can get hypo or episodes of low blood sugar, but so can just young women in general.
I think, thank you for that. That was a brilliant explanation. I think just to sum up the key takeaway from it, I feel it's blood sugar imbalances the causation of painful periods does not come from blood sugar imbalances that can potentially cause higher inflammation and painful periods. Also, insulin resistance, it's a much more complex issue that doesn't just come about because your blood sugar levels go up and down a little bit. And as young women in our 20s and early 30s, when estrogen is at its peak and we're in our reproductive years, it's not as easy as people say. And I keep saying as people say because this is all I'm seeing on social media. Maybe I'm just following all the wrong people here, Lara, and you're all the right
because I haven't seen that at all. But
I think this is a very important key takeaway from it. Please stop thinking that a slightly high blood sugar spike is going to cause inflammation and your painful periods. It's much more complex than that. And insulin resistance is much more complex than just being something that gets damaged because of a few high blood sugar levels and low blood sugar level spikes. And estrogen protects you. And this is something that you should remember.
Yeah. I mean, insulin resistance has its causes are multiple, and I talk about that in the book, but it's a lot more to do with it's not caused by having blood sugar go up and down. And I think what a lot of women are experiencing, I don't know if they're measuring this with like continuous glucose monitors or what they're seeing specifically, but they are. Okay. For just to say again, in young women, the main driver of that kind of, well, if they're seeing instability, and to be fair, it is normal for blood sugar to rise after a meal. So that's fine. Yes, so that's normal.
Let's say that and put it out there. Please don't expect that such a normal process not to happen because that's just how your body works.
stress increases blood sugar, and also um, a big driver, as I said, and I have a whole podcast about this. We can put this in the show notes. A big driver of episodes of low blood sugar in young women who don't have insulin resistance is the autonomic nervous system. So I don't know how much you're seeing in social media about that, sort of the balance
Much.
between sympathetic and parasympathetic. So women just tend to have a quite a differently calibrated autonomic nervous system compared to men. Well, actually, I would phrase it that men have a differently calibrated nervous system
Thank
compared
you.
to
I
us.
love that.
So
I love that better.
yeah, so women, especially young women, their nervous system is just quite dynamic and quite responsive to the environment. And so one of the best ways I talk about in my podcast about it is about low blood sugar in young women. One of the best ways is, well, to sort of stabilize, really to send the right signals to the nervous system. It's not even so much about insulin in young women. It's about it can be very helpful to have enough protein. I mean, that's actually signaling another hormone called glucagon, which is sort of related to the autonomic nervous system as well. So yes, so eating more protein, especially in the morning and regularly, can really help stabilize the nervous system. Also, just all the things you need to do, you know, to feel better in terms of the nervous system. So, get enough rest, get time outside, yeah, connection with other people. Obviously, young women are highly social. All of us are social, but young women really do need that sort of more. I don't know if more than men, but women are really wired to like connect with others. So, and then there's other ways you can stabilize the nervous system and therefore prevent episodes of low blood sugar. Just simple things like magnesium can help with that, and potentially avoiding certain types of hormonal birth control, because hormonal birth control can kind of tend to destabilize various aspects of the nervous system. And yeah, so I hope that's clarifying it a little bit. Yeah, I feel like, yes, I can see from what you're describing now, there's been this weird mashup of, so there is a serious problem with insulin resistance in the population at large, and certainly some young women are affected by that for sure. But then you've got a lot of young women just having this sort of nervous system related blood sugar ups and downs who have somehow kind of got mushed together with and they're different topics. So in fact, this is inspiring me to write a blog post about this, maybe to try to, yeah.
That is great. I think that is so needed because, so for example, we hear so much about blood sugar spikes here and there all the time, but I don't think that women ever understood the important part nervous system regulation plays into
Yeah.
us not developing insulin resistance. And I think the focus is more on blood sugar imbalances. And I feel like, as you said, this got meshed up mainly because I don't know if you heard about the glucose goddess, but she is
All right.
extremely set into her mission to speak about how damaging blood sugar spikes are to
Right.
insulin resistance. So I don't really agree with that, as
Ah,
you mentioned, but I think she has a huge platform and she kind of educates people that is perhaps at the very basic level of explanation, and she has much more knowledge than that for sure. This is the idea that you kind of get out her books and her talks that she goes on and does about. So I feel like this is quite dangerous because a lot of people buy insane amounts of blood sugar monitors and try to keep their blood sugars as flat as possible, where that's just not normal and that's not how it should be. And one is not to do with another, first of all. So yeah, this is very good that you clarify this. And so as a summary, focus on your nervous system, enhance those social relationships, and your insulin is going to be just fine. And a blood sugar spike is not the end of the world.
so I through my lens anyway, and my understanding of insulin resistance, and certainly, the research I did for my latest book, which is all about insulin metabolism repair for women, it's in the other direction. So it's not that unstable blood sugar causes insulin resistance. It's that people who develop insulin resistance for a multiple of reasons can experience, blood sugar problems as a symptom. So I actually put blood sugar problems downstream.
Downstream, yeah.
Yeah. So just to say again, in young women, unless they've got other reasons to be like, unless it's, and they, again, some young women do have insulin resistance. So I can't just categorically say it's
Of course,
not
yeah.
a thing, but, um, just quite frankly, like and you'll see in the podcast that I wrote about, that I did about, hypoglycemia or low blood sugar in young women, that group of young women who experience that are not the ones who go on to develop insulin resistance. They're quite different things. So I think no. So having a tendency to low blood sugar or does not cause insulin resistance. It's and actually this hyper focus on tracking. I do have a section on continuous glucose monitors in my book. I'm not a fan really, if especially if it creates this, as you're describing, sort of more anxiety around
Yeah, absolutely.
what is happening. Like because stress and other factors can affect blood sugar so much that I think to hyper focus on that misses the opportunity to just like put the energy into like the other things that you sort of need to feel healthier. So I don't myself wear a continuous glucose monitor. I'm not totally anti them. I think maybe for some people it can, maybe for people more who do have insulin resistance. But again,
Or
I think what you're describing is
diabetes,
a whole
yes.
group of young women who don't have it. So
And I was one of those women myself as a few years ago on this trend. Like I always had a blood sugar monitor on my arm. I always wanted to keep
all right.
that spike from happening. And then I
All right.
realized, as you say, this has caused me so much anxiety that it was making my blood sugar spikes worse and my
Oh wow.
quality worse. So ever since then, I always tell people just please take care of your diet, please take care of your environment, make sure you're surrounded by good people, you have a good, quality of life. And that's everything that you need to do to stay healthy, unless obviously you have some other problems, underlying metabolic conditions. But generally, for a young woman, is not really needed, I would say, unless there's an underlying to it, because it can definitely cause so much anxiety. It's yeah.
Okay, so probably most of your audience does not have insulin resistance. I'm just guessing, but let's just try to characterize maybe some women who
Yeah,
do
shall we? Let's do it.
um legitimately. So and they're out there. So they definitely so um again, the picture of insulin resistance, it's not characterized by an unstable blood sugar. That's not the what that's not a diagnostic for it. It's actually more the things I mentioned before. So like the more classic form of PCOS where there are um so like a strong jawline acne, significant facial hair, body hair, um only like 3 or 4 periods in a year, and often those won't be painful periods, by the way. Those will just be just like a 10-day bleed that comes, maybe 4 times a year or something. And then usually there will be pretty significant weight gain around the middle,
Mhm.
um, around the abdomen and sort of right under the rib cage. That's what this waist circumference looks like. And usually, and not, it is possible. That said, it is possible to have a sort of smaller body size and have insulin resistance. But there'll be something on blood tests, like there'll be a tendency to high triglycerides, something called high ALT, potentially high fasting insulin, which is totally different than glucose. It's a different test. Um, or there's a couple other markers, sort of high CRP, high ferritin. So these are different, right? So and if none of that is present, and the other good marker of insulin resistance in a woman is low SHBG. I know this is getting very technical, but people might have that on their blood tests. It's often done together with testosterone and something called sex hormone binding globulin, or SHBG. That'll typically in a young woman that should be quite high.
Yeah,
Um, and it's definitely made high by being on the pill. So anyone on the pill can't, rely on
I rely on that.
those.
That's very
No, but for someone who's not on the pill, if SHBG is low and there's any of those other things especially if the doctors mention anything about fatty liver disease, that's the insulin resistance picture. And it's not, I mean, it's out there. So it's probably about 1 in 10 young women. So possibly 1 in 10 of your listeners legitimately have insulin resistance and, need to then certainly my book Metabolism Repair for Women could be helpful for them. And to be fair, in the book I don't really, as you'll see because you've read the book, like I don't really focus on micromanaging blood sugar because
yeah.
I think
I
that's just
noticed that. Yes.
exhausting. Like instead you want to go, yeah. So I'm just, instead of talking to you, I'm like, I need to do a blog post about, okay, don't micromanage your blood sugar because that
Yeah,
is no,
that's
like
also a good one. Yeah.
I can't even imagine doing that myself. It's just like that just feels mentally exhausting just thinking about it. So
Many other things you could be doing, right? I think
yeah,
this
with your life.
with your life. Yes.
Yeah.
I think this is such a good list of like tests to do and symptoms to take a good look at in terms of insulin resistance. And this brings me
Yeah.
to the next topic that I'd like to speak to you, which is
Okay.
resistant PCOS. So we know
Right.
that worldwide, 8 to 13% of women, I suppose is the latest statistics, of reproductive
Yeah.
age have PCOS. And one of the most, there's several types of PCOS, but one of the most common types of PCOS is insulin resistant PCOS. And in one of your most recent articles, you mentioned that using the Rotterdam criteria to diagnose PCOS is a bit too wide and too inclusive, allowing girls, young girls, especially that just get their period and don't even have that connection well established to be diagnosed with PCOS when it shouldn't really be the case. So I'm just wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on that article because I thought your point of view was fascinating and it's something clicked
Yeah.
at it.
Well, the big problem with the Rotterdam, so and I'm not the only, a lot of experts have concerns about it. It allows with this weird, you can have two out of the three of the criteria. It actually, what that allows is for women to be given the diagnosis when they do not have androgen excess or excess testosterone, which is through my lens, through, a lot of experts, that's just makes no sense at all because essentially PCOS is by definition the situation of high testosterone or androgen excess in women, at least in symptoms. There might not be measurable high testosterone, but there has to be the symptoms of high testosterone, which is the ones I've been describing. So strong jawline acne, significant like, facial hair, not just a little bit wispy on the upper
Mm.
lip, but like, significant facial hair.
Well, it's just
It,
while we talk about the hair aspect of things, I got like a question that would fit really well with what you're describing right
yeah.
now, because a lot of women develop coarse black nipple hair. And is that something as well that you would say that is associated with the other aspects of like developing a hair on like facial hair for women?
Yes.
Mm.
Short answer, yes. Now, in terms of so this is called androgen excess or excess testosterone. It is a legitimate symptom, or like condition. And if anyone has been given the label of PCOS and they don't have at least some, even sort of a moderate version, like symptoms of androgen excess, then I would say they don't have PCOS. They may have been misdiagnosed using the Rotterdam criteria. Unfortunately, the Rotterdam criteria, what it's done actually is a lot of women with hypothalamic amenorrhea or just post pill amenorrhea are told they have PCOS.
So
So
two questions there because I feel like maybe not everyone knows what hypothalamic amenorrhea is
yeah,
or what the Rotterdam criteria actually entails. So could you just mention the three criteria of Rotterdam criteria and then what is hypothalamic amenorrhea?
yeah. So the Rotterdam, in fact, I was just writing about it yesterday. So it's what essentially one of the things they're doing. So I need to bring up the three criteria in front of me here. Let me just the two of the three, right? Okay. So this is where they go wrong. So hyperandrogenism, so high testosterone is one of the criteria. And then the other two are irregular ovulation or anovulation and or polycystic ovaries. So this is where it goes wrong because essentially they allow, if you can allow only two of the three, you could be diagnosed based on irregular ovulation and polycystic ovaries alone. And they are basically kind of the same thing. So in my article, maybe the one you saw, we talked about they're essentially counting that same symptom twice. So the polycystic ovaries and ultrasound really just means that ovulation has not occurred in that cycle. So if you then you're so then really all you're diagnosing, if you're allowed to pick only two of the three and ignore, not have the high androgenism, the high androgen or high testosterone, then you have ignored, then you're able to diagnose a woman with normal, no androgen symptoms, no high testosterone symptoms with PCOS. This is where the problem is breaking down. This is where the whole system is breaking down and causing the problem. So hypothalamic amenorrhea is the loss of periods. It can be irregular periods or the loss of periods due to something, either stress, illness, or most commonly undereating. So if women, and Rotterdam technically is supposed to rule those out. It's supposed to, any of the set of criteria are supposed to have, and other explanations have been ruled out. But that step's often not happening. So what you get in practical terms with Rotterdam is women who lost their period to undereating being told they have PCOS. And it's a huge problem actually, because it's actually a like enormous problem. And I've seen this in my own clinic because young women, if they've already lost their period to undereating, and then they're told PCOS, and then they're told PCOS is about insulin resistance, then they potentially, go low carb or start restricting their diet when they've already are too restricted. So these are women who will, who will
Fuel the
potentially just never.
problem, basically. Yeah, like
It's a
keep.
huge problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I forget where. Oh, wait, right. So we started with kind of the topic of PCOS. So first of all, so step one is it truly PCOS? As in, is there signs of high testosterone, or is it something else? So obviously, hypothalamic amenorrhea is one of the things it could be, something else that it could be. But there's other explanations for high testosterone or high androgen. So high prolactin is another one. There's something called adrenal hyperplasia, which is pretty common. It's about 1 in 100 women. So it's often gets misdiagnosed as PCOS, and the treatment is different. So does need to be some clarity around assessment. But even then, once it is diagnosed as PCOS, true PCOS, as in high androgens, and other causes of high androgens have been ruled out, then there is some differentiation between is it associated with insulin resistance? 80% of the time it is. There's small groups of women for whom they do have PCOS, but there's no insulin resistance. That would be way less common. And that would often be something called adrenal PCOS, which is actually like more to do with high androgen production from the adrenal glands. And that is typically not associated with insulin resistance. So this is why, certainly in my work, I've talked about like the importance of, even once you're certain of the PCOS diagnosis, it is important to try to get that confirmation that insulin resistance is present. And that would be based on some of those tests that I talked about before, like low SHBG, like high triglycerides, like weight gain around the middle, high fasting insulin. Those are all things that can confirm insulin resistance and within under the PCOS diagnosis. So once women have that information, then it's a lot more clear they want to move ahead with treatments that help to improve insulin sensitivity. And again, that's not about micromanaging glucose. That's going to be about addressing some of the underlying hormonal condition of insulin resistance, which is, just to give an example, a really great way to do that is the supplement inositol, which is obviously hugely popular in the PCOS group, and for right reason. It's good reason. It's been clinically trialed to improve insulin sensitivity. And just fun fact, inositol is something that we used to have a lot more of in our diet, and it's one of the missing nutrients in our modern diet. So as you saw in my book, Metabolism Repair for Women, I do talk about like the change in the food supply and the modern food supply and all the ways that it's different. And one of the problems is that some of the missing nutrients in it compared to what people were eating even a few generations ago. So it
Absolutely.
is possible to, just supplement. And then there's obviously all very troubleshooting strategies to improve insulin sensitivity, and it's reversible, so especially for young women. And the other way insulin resistant PCOS is reversible is as soon as they can start to improve insulin resistance, start to ovulate, then our own hormones, estrogen and progesterone, that come from ovulation, essentially, once they kick in, both of those hormones are improved insulin sensitivity. So I talked right at the beginning of how higher estrogen levels is essentially shelters women to some extent from insulin resistance. So women with true PCOS who haven't been ovulating and making very much estrogen and progesterone can start to do that. And then, so it becomes sort of, once you get the ball rolling, it becomes insulin sensitivity should keep improving.
That's great. Such a lot of value in this. So let me just try to summarize it a little bit. So basically, Rotterdam Criteria, a bit dangerous to diagnose everyone based on that, because it can mean that we can not necessarily fit someone in the box of PCOS if they don't have high androgens, which is high testosterone, those facial hair, nipple hair, and that's an essential way to diagnose PCOS. The other thing is we should try to incorporate some lifestyle changes if we do end up getting diagnosed with PCOS. But there's also the other side of things, that it can be hypothalamic amenorrhea. So if we don't have high androgens, look into that as well. If you have been diagnosed with PCOS but don't have high androgens, it can actually be hypothalamic amenorrhea. So once you look into that, also look into prolactin, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, and then once you do end up being diagnosed with insulin-resistant PCOS with high androgens and either one or the other two of the criterias, then you can start incorporating perhaps myo-inositol.
So, and also in my book, I talk about it. You could also just take straight myo-inositol, which is probably the easier plan. I don't know that. I mean, you can get a fancier supplement that has, a small amount of D-chiro, which is there's some debate around that. But at the end of the day, most of my patients just take
Just go
myo-inositol.
for the simple one. Myo-inositol
So
is super effective.
yeah. And I'll just point out the Rotterdam is not the only criteria out there, right? Like there are other diagnostic criteria for PCOS. There's the Androgen Excess Society criteria, and they require um all of the no, they require both androgen excess for sure has to be there and some sign of anovulation, whether and the polycystic ovaries could be a sign of anovulation. So anovulation means sort of having bleeds or periods where you haven't ovulated. So that they require. So if the clinician follows the Androgen Excess Society criteria, then they will, then they're less likely to misdiagnose someone with PCOS, someone who basically, just to say again, if there's no evidence of androgen excess, then it's not PCOS. That I think I can say that pretty categorically. That's just been a weird thing that's happened since the Rotterdam came out, and yeah, it's gonna have to change.
I
Yeah.
think that's really refreshing because a lot of women say, "Oh, I don't have an ovulation," or "I know that I have PCOS because my doctor diagnosed me with it based on an ultrasound." And every time I hear
Yeah.
my clients coming to me to say that, I'm asking, "Did they even test your testosterone level?" It's like, do you
Yeah.
even have any signs of excess androgen? So it's really good for people to hear that if you don't have anything to do with excess androgens like testosterone or facial hair or things of that nature, you most likely do not have PCOS, and look in another place because it will save you some time.
Correct. And again, it can be that it doesn't necessarily have to be a high testosterone on blood tests because that's not always there. But yes, as you say, there have to be some symptoms, some signs. The other situation where the ultrasound finding of polycystic ovaries is confusing things is actually a whole other topic. But women who have endometriosis or persistent pelvic pain being told, then have an ultrasound and then told, you have a polycystic ovaries. So then like somehow that's the explanation for the pelvic pain, but it's not. So anyone, just to be clear, about 1 in 3, if you were to just randomly do an ultrasound on any woman out there, just pull her into the ultrasound lab, and even if she's perfectly fine, has nothing going on with her hormones, 1 in 3 times she'll show polycystic ovaries. It just means you've had a cycle where you didn't ovulate. So you can have pain, persistent pelvic pain, possibly endometriosis or pelvic floor dysfunction or lots of other causes of pelvic pain, gut problems, and then happen to also have polycystic ovaries, but it doesn't mean the pain is from that, right? So this is another area where I just think, yeah, the ultrasound finding of polycystic ovaries just has to be ignored because it's creating so much confusion. And then can you imagine if you've got chronic pelvic pain, possibly from intestinal permeability, leaky gut, or some aspect of endometriosis, or like some aspect of pelvic floor dysfunction, and then you're told PCOS, but then you go and start thinking stabilizing your blood sugar is going to treat your pelvic pain. It's not. Yeah, I guess we talked about this right
Oh,
at the beginning.
that is
So yeah.
that is such a sad thing to even think about, that so many women actually try to do that in the hope that every one of their problems will be solved. So this is great to have had this chat with you, because I feel like the listeners of this podcast will be like, okay, now I know what to focus my energy on better next.
Yeah.
What actually
Well,
works.
I've had so many patients who say to me, I've tried everything for PCOS, but I still have this pain. And I'm like, well, for starters,
You don't have
pain is not a
PCOS.
symptom of PCOS. And also, what have you tried? And they'll be like, oh, I went, low carb and I took inositol. And I'm like, those are all, that's not, those aren't treatments for pain.
Mhm.
Um, Although to be fair, I mean, just full disclosure, I mean, there's always nuance, right? There's always like having a lot
Of
of,
course.
a lot of sugar in the diet, like a really junk food diet, heavy in sugar that's not helping pain, probably. I mean, that's probably more from its role in what it's doing to intestinal permeability and like dysbiosis and things like that. So certainly, a very sugary junk food diet is is can be a driver of pain, but probably more via the gut than via blood sugar.
Yeah, so just full disclosure, we are not endorsing whatsoever a diet high
No,
on here.
no.
We're just saying that blood sugar levels are not as easily, manipulated, and your insulin resistance, it's not as easy as you might think it is. A whole food diet
One,
is essential, and your go-to and your best
yeah.
bet, still your best.
So this has been a very valuable conversation for me because I don't think I hadn't received from my patients quite what you're describing here. This like how many young women are out there trying to micromanage their blood sugar. I guess I didn't realize that was a thing. So I might try to do some content around that.
This is a very
Yeah.
this is a very dangerous topic that a lot of women have slided
Huh.
into. And I know when I sent you the questions for the podcast, you're like, "What?" And yeah, I know you were very surprised, and you're like, "Are you sure?" But yeah, it is unfortunately is a very real thing. Real money is being spent into glucose monitors for people
Huh.
that don't have diabetes, don't have insulin resistance, and a lot of anxiety comes out a result of that, and not much else, to be honest. So
Huh.
it's great that we speak
Yeah.
about this. I have one final
Perfect.
question, which you briefly mentioned earlier in terms of weight gain. So, what is the role of, actually, a two-part question? What is the role of
Yeah.
resistance, if you can describe it in a bit more detail, into weight gain? Because I know that this is something that a lot of women are interested in with the when they say, I am trying so much to lose weight, I have a great diet, but I can't. Is it blood sugar levels? Is it insulin resistance? What is it? So, what is the connection between insulin resistance and weight gain? And is insulin resistance reversible to the point that it allows us to lose weight, if there's any connection at all there, a bit more easily?
There is a connection. I mean, certainly I'm in the camp where there's different. So the mainstream narrative has been that people gain weight, gain fat just pretty much because of, bad willpower or something. That's sort of the mainstream narrative is like, oh, you just allowed yourself to gain weight. And then that causes insulin resistance. That's the mainstream. But like obviously in my book, I'm in the other camp where there is growing evidence that for people who are experiencing significant weight gain, especially around the middle, the insulin resistance came first. And what happens then is when insulin is chronically elevated, it does disrupt hunger regulation, so it can make people a lot hungrier than normal. One of the downstream symptoms of more severe insulin resistance is food noise. This just like what they call this constant like, I have to eat more, I have to eat this, I shouldn't eat that, like just this constant like thinking about food 24 hours a day. Well, I guess minus a few hours sleeping. But and then the other thing that chronically elevated insulin would do is impair the body's ability to access fat for energy. Now, so it is a driver. There's no question that chronically elevated insulin can be a driver of, you know, serious weight gain, especially that weight gain around the middle. But not all body. In the book, I talk a lot of between the visceral fat weight gain that's associated, essentially probably comes from insulin resistance to a large extent, and subcutaneous fat. So young women do tend to gain, like just giving another example, like just to give a compare and contrast. And I do talk about this in the book in terms of, I have a section on gynoid shape. So some young women do gain a lot of bum fat. That is not from insulin resistance. So just to, separate that out. So it sort of does depend on somewhat, on the body shape. And I guess there can be, well, technically, bum fat is actually more from kind of estrogen and genetics, and there's going to be other drivers of that. So, and I have a section in the book, you might remember, don't break your heart trying to lose a big bum, because I
I
think like,
get that section
like,
because, yeah, there is women just like really try to get rid of that, but it's just your hormones. It's just like sometimes the way you're built, and it's natural.
women who tend to, if someone's got that really strong hourglass, like narrow waist and big bum, that's a lot of that's genetic. And a lot of that is, that's just to say again, that's not from insulin resistance. That is, I think that is hardwired to some extent. I sort of really don't like to see women trying to diet that away, because I think that's, because actually bum fat's quite good for you. And some women just have more than others. But, and then there's another condition called lipedema, which I go into in the book, which is a not a healthy state. This is inflamed lower body fat. This is, again, a whole topic on its own. So people can look at that section in my book or read about more about lipedema. But lipedema would not specifically be downstream from insulin resistance either. So insulin resistance, chronically elevated insulin, just to say again, kind of tends to drive the fat gain it drives is that around the middle. And so if that, and that could be happening in young women, especially in the PCOS group. So in that case, yes, the strategy I propose in the book is to, go back to the beginning of like actually try to get to the source of what's happening and help to address any metabolic obstacles that may be contributing to insulin resistance. And then, you know, have then to look for the first things that will change will be, feeling less, just naturally feeling less hungry, having more energy. Insulin should start to, fasting insulin, if you're measuring it, should start to come down. Although I don't think everyone needs to measure that. And then, specifically losing some centimeters around the waist. That would be,
Good.
that would be the outcome. So again, as you can tell from the book, I'm not a fan of like, tracking weight on the scale as much. I think, but at the same time, I don't want to sort of make people feel bad if losing, just changing the number on the scale is their main goal, then okay. But I do invite people to think about from a metabolic perspective and think about improving insulin sensitivity, losing that weight specifically around the waist if that's where they need to lose it, and kind of making that the focus. And that's a lot easier to get traction on that than it is to, specifically lose weight on the scale. Of course, with women now, we're all in this, it's all in the territory of, body image and all, feeling we all need to look a certain way. And maybe one of the closing points I'll make is, so you remember in the book, I do talk about the different body types or body shapes, and some people are just never going to look like other people. And so, but what tends to happen, of course, is just from natural selection. We get a lot of the influencers on social media, on Instagram, are going to be the naturally skinny types who like, they do well on the, protein 5 times a day and, hitting the gym first thing in the morning, and, and that's all working for them. But one takeaway from my book is you can't necessarily look at what's working for a skinny person and think that's what is going to work for me, because what works for the fitness crew, what they feel good doing and kind of is not necessarily what people who are trying to recover from insulin resistance need. So
Or can even
and
have the
also,
energy to do it, because some of those
yeah,
lifestyles are just so drastic,
yeah,
crazy. So let's not
right.
try to replicate what we see on the internet, and more than that, just eat good food and perhaps move. Sometimes less is more. Move a little bit, do more walks, and just see if those inches are starting to come off around the waist. Then you're in a healthy place, and health, it's what we should strive for, not necessarily the aesthetics. Everyone would like to look amazing, right? As you said, like the influencers online, but most of us are just not there genetically. And as long as we're healthy, that's what should matter.
Well, and also I'll just say it's not recovering from insulin resistance is not just about diet and exercise. So it's not just about finding the perfect diet and exercise regimen, because that's tempting. It's like, oh, if I could just get the right combination. Because it's a lot of, because of the fact, as I explain in the book, that insulin sensitivity is affected, it's a whole body project, right? So it's affected by the gut microbiome, it's affected by the nervous system, it's affected by lots of different hormones. It's affected by, like, just to give another example, like certain types of birth control can cause insulin resistance. So, this is where it is a whole body project. And yeah, some people are just not, if their problem is in their gut or a medication they're taking or something like that, like they're not necessarily going to get the results from just finding the perfect diet and exercise. And I agree with you that sometimes, and a lot of people out there would agree that, too much exercise can be a problem too. So sometimes less is more when it comes to movement and having enough time for rest and recovery.
What
Yeah.
would you say to someone that would come to you and say, I have PCOS, I have insulin resistance? What is the 5 things that I should be doing in order to? I know you mentioned throughout some blood tests, some type of exercise, some type of like way of eating, but if you were to summarize reversing insulin sensitivity, which we know it's possible, and supporting PCOS, reversing insulin resistance and
Yeah.
supporting PCOS,
Yeah.
what would you say from your experience are the main few things? And I know it's going to be hard to summarize, but let's try to give a few useful tips to our listeners.
Um, and again, it's individual. And I know that's cliche, but it truly is individual. So I guess step one would be I would actually try to confirm insulin resistance with that individual. So just to make sure that we're all, talking about the same thing. And then, yeah, I guess if we wanted to boil it, I'll try to boil it down to, five. Bearing in mind, depending on the individual, one of their five might be changing their medication or fixing a gut problem. There's two of the 10 patient stories in my book are about fixing a gut problem to fix insulin resistance. And I'll just say that's through my lens as a naturopathic doctor. As you know, the gut affects everything. Despite there's a lot of evidence in the scientific literature as well that dysbiosis or intestinal permeability drives insulin resistance. So yes, depending on the nature of their gut, we might actually start with that. But beyond that, I guess, it is true that getting some protein earlier in the day, especially morning and lunchtime protein, can really help people to feel better and help to stabilize hunger. Um, then I will talk about, I often will do some sort of supplementation just because I think some of the missing nutrients in our modern diet is part of what's driving insulin resistance. So the five I mentioned in the book, I'll just have to go through them really quickly. Magnesium, taurine, choline, uh, glycine, and inositol. We mentioned inositol already. I often would prescribe inositol just because it's done so well in its clinical trials. I would talk about normalizing, trying to stabilize circadian rhythm. Um, and that supports the nervous system, making sure there's enough time for rest, and then yes, it does have to be some. You want to be building muscle. You want muscle is important because muscle is a metabolic organ. So I try to work with my patients with what really suits them. I think people for whom strength training is available and feels good, I think most people with insulin resistance want to have some version of strength training on board, but that could even just be like, at home, you know, body weight exercises and resistance bands and things like that. So I don't know if that was five, but it was close to five. And yeah, so
That's great. Thank you so much, Lara. This was so information packed and value packed, and I'm sure it's going to help a
yeah.
lot of women. Thank you so much for your time today, and hopefully we'll have you on the Speakeasy Health podcast again.
All right. Thanks.